The fragile princess. The grand halls of the palace were eerily quiet. Princess Lyra, the only daughter of the mighty alien king, sat in her room, staring out at the twin moons above her planet. The rebellion had grown stronger over the past months, and whispers of war now echoed through the palace walls. Lyra had spent her life protected, sheltered from danger. Her body was fragile, and her father had always treated her like glass, delicate and easily broken. But tonight, the world she knew would shatter. Lyra's hands trembled as she adjusted the small communicator in her ear. She had overheard the council speaking earlier that day. They believed the rebels would attack soon, possibly even tonight. She wanted to warn her father, but he had been too busy preparing for a public address to listen. "Stay in your chambers, Lyra," he had said firmly. "You're safest here." Suddenly, the palace alarms blared, a loud, screeching sound that made her heart race. She froze, her pale skin turning even whiter. Outside her door, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor, followed by the sharp crack of blaster fire. Her heart sank. The rebellion was here. Her door burst open, and her personal guard, a loyal soldier named Eric, rushed in. His armor was scorched, and blood dripped from a cut on his forehead. "Princess, we must go. They've breached the palace walls," he said urgently. Lyra's legs felt weak. "Go? Where? What about my father?" she stammered. Eric shook his head, his voice grim. "The king ordered me to protect you. We have a ship ready to take you off-world. If they capture you, they'll use you to control them. We can't let that happen." She hesitated, torn between fear and duty. But as the sound of explosions grew louder, she realized she had no choice. Grabbing the small pendant her father had given her, a symbol of her royal lineage, she followed Eric into the hallway. The once beautiful palace was now a war zone. Fires raged, and smoke filled the air. Rebels dressed in dark armor stormed the corridors, shouting orders and firing at anything that moved. Lyra clung to Eric, her thin frame trembling as they darted through the chaos. "Stay close," Eric commanded, leading her down a hidden passageway. But their escape was cut short when a group of rebels blocked their path. Eric pulled out his weapon, a sleek plasma pistol, and fired. His shots were precise, but the rebels outnumbered him. "Run, princess," he shouted, pushing her toward a side door. "No, I can't leave you," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Eric turned to her, his eyes fierce. "You're the future of this kingdom, Lyra. If you fall, so does everything your father has built. Now go." With a heavy heart, she obeyed, slipping through the door and running as fast as her weak legs would carry her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her vision blurred from tears. At last, she reached the palace hangar. A small escape pod sat waiting, its engines humming softly. Two royal technicians waved her over, urgency written on their faces. "Hurry, Your Highness. The rebels are closing in." As Lyra climbed into the pod, a deafening explosion rocked the hangar. She turned just in time to see the technicians engulfed in flames. A rebel soldier emerged from the smoke, his weapon aimed directly at her. Panic surged through her. She fumbled with the pod's controls, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Just as the rebel pulled the trigger, the pod's hatch sealed shut. The shot ricocheted off the reinforced glass, and the pod launched into the sky. Lyra collapsed into the seat, her chest heaving, as she watched her home fade into the distance. The stars stretched out before her, cold and unfeeling. She was alone now, drifting through the void. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the pendant around her neck. Her father, her people, she had left them behind. But deep down, she knew Eric was right. If the rebels captured her, it would be the end of everything. The pod's autopilot guided her to a distant human outpost on the edge of the galaxy. It was a place her father had mentioned once, a haven for those seeking refuge. Lyra had never met a human before. Her father often spoke of them with mixed feelings. brave but unpredictable. As the pod entered the outpost's atmosphere, Lyra felt a spark of hope. Maybe someone there could help her. She was no warrior, but she was determined to protect her people. The fragile princess who had always been hidden away now had to face the universe head-on. The pod landed with a soft thud on a barren, rocky terrain. The outpost loomed in the distance, a collection of rugged buildings under a dome of artificial light. Lyra stepped out, her legs unsteady, and took her first breath of alien air. It was cold and sharp, unlike anything she had known. In the distance, she saw a figure approaching, a tall human man with a stern expression and a weapon slung over his shoulder. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "What's an alien princess doing all the way out here?" he asked, his voice cold but curious. Lyra straightened, her fear momentarily replaced by determination. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "My world is falling, and if you don't help me, yours might be next." The man raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You've got 2 minutes to explain," he said. "Then I decide if you're worth the trouble." The reluctant human. The rocky ground crunched under Captain James Carter's boots as he stared at the alien princess standing before him. She was trembling, her wide silver eyes filled with desperation. But there was something else. Determination. Carter had seen many refugees stumble into this forgotten outpost over the years, but none quite like her. She was too clean, too fragile, too out of place. "You're kidding, right?" he said, crossing his arms. "An alien princess. That's the best story you've got." Lyra's face flushed with a mix of fear and frustration. "I am telling the truth. My father is the king of Averis, and if you don't help me, millions will die, including humans." Carter tilted his head, letting the silence stretch. He had fought in wars, seen planets reduced to rubble, and lost friends to causes bigger than himself. The last thing he wanted was to get tangled up in another conflict, especially one involving royalty. But something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she clutched the pendant around her neck, like it was her lifeline. Maybe it was the raw panic in her voice. Or maybe he was just too tired to walk away. "All right, princess," he said, his tone sharp. "Let's say I believe you. What do you expect me to do? I'm one man, not an army." Lyra straightened her back, drawing on the scraps of courage she had left. "You don't need an army. You just need to help me survive long enough to get back to my people." Carter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Survive, huh? You don't look like you've ever seen a fight in your life. What happens when the rebels catch up to you?" "I'll fight," she said quickly, but her voice faltered. "I just need someone to teach me." Carter chuckled, a bitter sound. "You? Fight? Princess, you'd snap like a twig." Lyra's hands balled into fists at her sides. "I have no choice. If I stay weak, my people will fall, and so will yours. The rebels aren't just after Averis. They want to conquer the galaxy. They'll come for Earth next." That caught his attention. Carter's expression darkened, the ghost of old battles flashing in his eyes. He had fought to protect Earth once, long ago, and the thought of it being threatened again made his stomach turn. Still, this wasn't his fight, or so he told himself. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he muttered. "But guts won't save you out here. Fine, I'll teach you the basics, but don't get any ideas. The moment this gets too messy, I'm out." Relief washed over Lyra's face. "Thank you. That's all I ask." The next morning, Carter led her to a clearing just beyond the outpost. The air was cold and sharp, the sun casting a harsh light on the rocky terrain. Lyra stood awkwardly, her thin frame dwarfed by the oversized jacket he had tossed her way. "First lesson," Carter said, tossing a wooden stick at her feet. "Pick that up." Lyra blinked, confused. "A stick?" "Yep. Your hands are too soft for real weapons, princess. We're starting small." She hesitated but bent down to pick it up. The stick felt clumsy in her hands, and when Carter swung his own toward her, she yelped. barely managing to block the blow. "Pathetic," he said, shaking his head. "You'll never survive at this rate." Her cheeks burned with humiliation, but she tightened her grip on the stick. "I'll do better," she muttered. For hours, he drilled her, forcing her to block, dodge, and strike. Her arms ached, and sweat soaked through her clothes, but she didn't stop. Every time she faltered, Carter's sharp words pushed her forward. Again, he barked after her 100th failed attempt to block his swing. "I can't," she panted, dropping to her knees. "You think the rebels will give you a break because you're tired?" He snapped. "Get up." Lyra's vision blurred with tears, but she gritted her teeth and stood. Something inside her refused to give up, even as her body screamed for rest. Carter watched her, his expression unreadable. Beneath his tough exterior, he was surprised. Most people would have quit long ago, but not her. By the end of the day, Lyra collapsed onto the ground, her limbs trembling. Carter crouched beside her, offering a canteen of water. "Not bad for a princess," he said gruffly. "But don't think one day of training makes you ready for war." "I'll keep going," she whispered, her voice hoarse but resolute. "I'll keep going until I'm strong enough." Carter stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see about that." That night, as Lyra rested in the corner of the small shack Carter called home, he sat by the window, cleaning his blaster. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and he knew the rebels wouldn't stop hunting her. His instincts told him to cut ties and walk away before things got worse. But something about her reminded him of himself, a fighter who didn't know when to quit. And against his better judgment, he decided to stick around, at least for now. Unbeknownst to them, a rebel scout had tracked Lyra's escape pod to the outpost. In the shadows of the nearby cliffs, the scout watched, reporting back to his superiors. The princess wasn't safe yet. The first battle. The sound of dry wind howling through the rocky terrain was the only thing Lyra heard as she held her breath. The small outpost, once her refuge, now felt like a trap. Carter crouched beside her, his weapon drawn, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "Stay low. Don't make a sound," he whispered, his tone calm but urgent. Lyra nodded, clutching the crude blaster Carter had handed her just moments ago. It felt heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. She had trained for days, bruised and battered herself into exhaustion, but none of it prepared her for this. Rebels had tracked her here. The hunter had become the hunted. The setup. The first sign of trouble came at dawn when Carter noticed footprints leading to the cliffs above the outpost. The tracks were fresh, and too precise to belong to a wandering trader. "We've got company," he had said, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. Now, as the two of them huddled behind a cluster of rocks near the outpost's edge, Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She peeked around the corner and saw them. 5 rebels, heavily armed, their black armor glinting under the harsh sunlight. They moved like predators, their weapons sweeping the area for signs of life. "They know I'm here," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't stop until they find me." "Then we'll make sure they regret it," Carter said, his voice low but firm. "The ambush begins." Carter handed Lyra a small device, a crude grenade cobbled together from old human tech. "When I give the signal, throw this as far as you can. Aim for that ridge," he instructed, pointing to a cluster of rocks where 2 rebels were stationed. Lyra hesitated, her hands shaking. "What if I miss?" "Then we're both dead," he replied bluntly, his eyes locking with hers. "You've trained for this. Trust yourself." She swallowed hard and nodded. As Carter slipped away into the shadows, her mind raced. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't even strong enough to carry the heavy armor Carter had offered her. But if she wanted to survive, if she wanted to save her people, she had to act. The rebels moved closer, their voices carried by the wind. "The outpost is abandoned," one of them said. "She's not here." "Keep looking," another growled. The princess couldn't have gotten far. From her hiding spot, Lyra could see Carter's silhouette creeping behind the rebels. He moved like a phantom, silent and precise. She gripped the grenade tightly, waiting for his signal. Suddenly, Carter fired a shot, hitting one of the rebels in the leg. The soldier fell with a scream, and chaos erupted. The other rebels scrambled for cover, shouting orders and firing wildly in Carter's direction. "Now, Princess," Carter's voice echoed through the chaos. Lyra's heart leaped into her throat, but she forced herself to move. She stood, pulled back her arm, and hurled the grenade with all her strength. It sailed through the air, landing perfectly on the ridge. The explosion was deafening, sending debris flying and forcing two rebels out of cover. For a moment, Lyra felt a surge of triumph. She had done it. But her victory was short-lived. One of the rebels spotted her and raised his weapon. She froze, her body paralyzed with fear as the blaster aimed directly at her. The turning point. Carter's voice cut through the air. "Down," he shouted. Lyra dropped to the ground just as Carter fired a shot, hitting the rebel square in the chest. The soldier crumpled, but the danger wasn't over. The remaining rebels regrouped, closing in on their position. "Stay with me," Carter barked, pulling Lyra to her feet. He handed her his backup weapon, a sleek pistol. "You know how to shoot. Use it." The rebels pushed forward, their fire relentless. Lyra crouched behind cover, her hands trembling as she aimed the pistol. She took a deep breath, remembering Carter's lessons. "Don't hesitate. Trust your instincts," he had told her. She squeezed the trigger. The shot hit one of the rebels in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. For the first time, Lyra felt a flicker of confidence. She wasn't just a helpless princess anymore. She could fight back. The aftermath. The battle was over in minutes, though it felt like hours. The last rebel fell to Carter's blade, his cries fading into the wind. Lyra stood amidst the wreckage, her hands still clutching the pistol. Her heart pounded, and her body ached, but she was alive. Carter approached her, his face a mix of exhaustion and approval. "Not bad for a rookie," he said, patting her on the shoulder. "I was terrified," she admitted, her voice shaky. "Good," he replied. "Fear keeps you alive. But you didn't let it stop you, and that's what matters." Lyra looked around at the fallen rebels, their black armor a stark contrast to the dusty ground. She felt a pang of guilt, but also something else. Pride. For the first time in her life, she had fought for herself. She wasn't just a fragile princess anymore. She was becoming something more. The shadow lurks. As the two of them prepared to leave, Carter noticed something unusual. One of the rebels carried a small device, a communicator. When he picked it up, a cold voice crackled through the static. "Squad 5, report. Have you found the princess?" Carter's expression darkened as he crushed the device under his boot. "They know you're still alive," he said, "and they'll send more." Lyra's chest tightened. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. With the rebels closing in, she knew the fight for her survival, and her people's freedom, had only just begun. The return home. The city of Avaris shimmered in the distance, its towering spires lit like beacons against the darkened sky. From their hiding spot on the ridge, Lyra stared at her home with a mix of longing and dread. The streets she had once walked freely now crawled with rebel soldiers, their black armored figures patrolling every corner. "Doesn't look like a warm welcome," Carter muttered, lowering the binoculars. His tone was casual, but Lyra didn't miss the tension in his jaw. "It's worse than I thought," she whispered. Her hands gripped the edge of the rocky outcrop, her knuckles white. "They've taken everything." "Not everything," Carter said, sliding the binoculars back into his pack. "You're still breathing, which means they haven't won. Yet." Lyra swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. She wasn't the fragile princess who had fled her palace weeks ago. She had trained, fought, and survived. But as she gazed at the occupied city, doubt crept in. Was she truly ready to return? To fight for her people? "Let's move," Carter said, interrupting her thoughts. "We've got a king to rescue." The underground network. Their journey into the city wasn't straightforward. Carter led Lyra through the forgotten alleys and hidden tunnels beneath Avaris, a maze of shadows and silence. It was clear he had done this before, navigating danger like second nature. Lyra, on the other hand, struggled to keep up, her nerves fraying with every step. "Stay close," Carter warned as they crept through an abandoned marketplace. "The rebels have eyes everywhere." Lyra nodded, clutching the dagger he had given her. Her blaster was hidden beneath her cloak, but the weight of it felt reassuring. Every sound, the creak of a board, the distant murmur of voices, set her on edge. At last, they reached a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Carter knocked twice on the wooden door, then 3 times more. A panel slid open, revealing a pair of wary eyes. "Who's there?" a voice growled. "Friends," Carter replied. "And we're in a hurry." The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped aside to let them in. Inside, the air was thick with tension. A group of loyalists, Avaris citizens still loyal to the king, huddled around a table, their faces a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "Is it true?" one of them asked, staring at Lyra. "The princess has returned." Lyra stepped forward, pulling back her hood to reveal her face. Gasps rippled through the room. And for a moment, she felt the weight of their expectations. These people were risking their lives for her family, for her. She couldn't afford to fail them. "I'm here to fight," she said, her voice steady. "But I can't do it alone." Rallying the loyalists. The loyalists were skeptical at first. To them, Lyra was still the fragile princess who had fled when the palace fell. But Carter stepped in, his voice cutting through their doubts like a blade. "She's not the same girl who ran away," he said firmly. "I've seen her fight. She's stronger than you think." Lyra met their gazes, one by one, and saw the flickers of hope returning to their eyes. "My father is still alive," she said. "If we rescue him, we can rally the people and take back the city. But I need your help to do it." After a long silence, one of the loyalists, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, nodded. "We'll follow you, Your Highness. Just say the word." The king's prison. The loyalists revealed that the king was being held in the central tower, a heavily guarded stronghold in the heart of the city. It was nearly impossible to reach without being detected, but Carter had a plan. "We'll create a diversion," he explained, pointing to a map of the city. "While the rebels are distracted, Lyra and I will infiltrate the tower. With luck, we'll be in and out before they even realize what's happening." "Luck?" Lyra raised an eyebrow. "That's your plan." Carter smirked. "Luck and a lot of firepower." The group spent the next few hours preparing. Weapons were distributed, escape routes planned. Lyra felt the weight of her role more than ever. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for these people, for her father, for her home. The first move. As night fell, the loyalists launched their diversion, a series of explosions that rocked the city, drawing the rebels' attention away from the tower. Smoke and fire filled the air, and chaos erupted in the streets. Under the cover of darkness, Lyra and Carter slipped through the shadows, their path lit only by the distant glow of flames. The closer they got to the tower, the tighter Lyra's chest felt. Her father was so close, but so was the enemy. They reached the base of the tower without incident, but as they approached the entrance, Carter held up a hand, signaling her to stop. 2 guards stood watch, their weapons at the ready. "Take the one on the left," he whispered, handing her a small blade. Quietly. Lyra's heart pounded as she crept toward the guard. Her training echoed in her mind. "Stay calm. Don't hesitate. Trust your instincts." When she struck, it was quick and precise, the guard crumpling silently to the ground. Carter dealt with the other guard just as efficiently. "Not bad, Princess," he murmured as they slipped inside. Suspense in the shadows. The tower was eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of machinery. Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine as they climbed the narrow staircase, every step bringing them closer to her father and the danger that awaited them. When they reached the top, Carter paused, his hand on the door. "Ready?" he asked. Lyra nodded, gripping her weapon tightly. "Let's finish this." Carter pushed the door open, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Her father sat in the center of the room, bound and bruised, but alive. But before she could take a step toward him, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Well, well," the rebel commander said, emerging from the darkness. "The princess returns." The trap had been sprung. The turning point. The rebel commander's voice was like a blade cutting through the tension. Lyra froze in the doorway, her father's battered figure just steps away but now overshadowed by the tall figure emerging from the shadows. The commander's black armor gleamed under the faint light, and his cold, calculating eyes locked onto her. "So predictable," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Did you really think you could waltz in here and rescue your father without us noticing?" Carter, standing just behind Lyra, shifted his stance, his weapon subtly at the ready. "Predictable or not, we're still here," he said, his voice steady and defiant. "And you're standing in the way." The commander laughed, a low, chilling sound. "You're outnumbered, human. You and your little princess won't make it out alive." Lyra's grip on her weapon tightened. She wasn't the fragile girl who had fled the palace. Not anymore. "You've already lost," she said, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. "This city, my people, they'll rise against you. This is just the beginning." The commander's smirk faltered for a moment before he raised his hand. "Let's see if you're still so brave when the fight begins." The trap unfolds. From the corners of the room, hidden doors slid open, and rebel soldiers poured in, their weapons aimed at Lyra and Carter. The two of them moved quickly, pressing their backs against the wall to avoid being surrounded. Carter whispered to Lyra, his tone urgent but calm. "Remember what I taught you. Stay focused. Watch your surroundings." Lyra nodded, her pulse racing. The odds were against them, but she refused to let fear take over. As the soldiers advanced, Carter fired the first shot, dropping one of them instantly. The room erupted into chaos. Lyra moved with precision, her training guiding her every step. She ducked under a rebel's swing, delivering a swift strike with the hilt of her blade. Another soldier lunged at her, but she sidestepped, firing her blaster and hitting him in the chest. The sound of battle was deafening, but Lyra's focus never wavered. The king's rescue. While Carter held off the soldiers, Lyra made her way to her father. He looked up at her, his eyes weary but filled with pride. "Lyra," he murmured, his voice weak. "I'm here, father," she said, cutting through his restraints with her blade. "We're getting you out of here." The king's hand grasped hers, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of his trust. But the moment was cut short as the rebel commander advanced toward them, his weapon drawn. "You think this changes anything?" The commander snarled. "You're just delaying the inevitable." Lyra stood in front of her father, her blade raised. "Maybe," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not running anymore." The duel. The commander charged, his strikes fast and brutal. Lyra barely managed to block his first attack, the force of it sending shockwaves through her arms. She stumbled back, but quickly recovered, her training taking over. Carter tried to intervene, but the soldiers kept him pinned down. "Lyra, stay sharp," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The duel was fierce, the commander's strength and experience pushing Lyra to her limits. But she had something he didn't: resilience. Every time she was knocked down, she got back up. Every time he thought he had her cornered, she found a way out. Finally, she saw an opening. As the commander raised his weapon for a final strike, she ducked and drove her blade into the joint of his armor. The commander let out a roar of pain, stumbling backward. Lyra didn't hesitate. She delivered a swift blow that sent him crashing to the ground. The room fell silent, the remaining soldiers hesitating as their leader lay defeated. Carter took the opportunity to dispatch the last of them. his movements efficient and brutal. The escape. With the rebels defeated, Lyra and Carter helped the king to his feet. "We need to move," Carter said, his voice firm. "Reinforcements won't be far behind." The three of them navigated the tower's winding corridors, their steps quick but cautious. The Loyalists' diversion had thrown the city into chaos, giving them the cover they needed. As they exited the tower, the sounds of explosions and shouting filled the air. Lyra glanced back at the tower, her heart heavy. This was just one victory in a much larger war. But for the first time, she felt hope. She wasn't running anymore. She was fighting. The turning point. As they reached the Loyalists' hidden base, Lyra turned to Carter, her eyes filled with determination. "We're not done," she said. "We have to take back the city." Carter smirked, wiping the blood from his blade. "You've got fire, Princess. Let's see if it's enough." The Loyalists cheered as the king entered the room, their spirits lifted by his presence. But Lyra knew the fight was far from over. The rebellion was strong, and the path ahead would be dangerous. Still, she felt a spark within her, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. The fragile princess was gone. In her place stood a warrior ready to lead her people to victory. The warrior princess. The Loyalist stronghold buzzed with energy as the people prepared for the final stand. Weapons were being sharpened, plans whispered in huddled groups, and the spark of rebellion ignited in every heart. At the center of it all stood Lyra, no longer the fragile princess hiding in the shadows. She wore armor now, its sleek design a mix of her planet's craftsmanship and human ingenuity. Her weapon rested firmly in her grip, and her silver eyes burned with resolve. Across from her, Carter leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "So what's the plan, Princess?" he asked, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Or should I say, Commander?" Lyra glanced at him, the weight of her decisions pressing heavily on her shoulders. "We take back the city," she said firmly. "But this time, we're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting to end this rebellion once and for all." Carter nodded, his smirk fading into a serious expression. "Big words. Let's see if you can back them up." The final push. The plan was ambitious, dangerous, even, but it was the only way. The Loyalists would strike in waves, creating chaos throughout the city while Lyra and Carter led a smaller team to confront the rebel leadership. The goal was simple: cut off the head of the rebellion. As they marched through the underground tunnels toward the city center, Lyra's heart pounded. Her father, though weakened from his captivity, had entrusted her with the command. "You're ready," he had said, his voice filled with pride. "Lead them, and they will follow." The tunnels ended at a hidden entrance near the rebel headquarters. Carter motioned for the group to stop, his sharp gaze scanning the area. "Looks clear," he whispered, "but that won't last long. Be ready." Lyra took a deep breath, steadying herself. "This is it," she said softly, gripping her weapon. "No turning back. The battle begins." The Loyalists surged into the streets, their war cries echoing through the city. The rebels, caught off guard by the coordinated attack, scrambled to respond. Fires lit up the night as the sounds of blasters and explosions filled the air. Lyra and Carter led their team through the chaos, their movements swift and precise. Lyra's training shone as she fought her way through the enemy lines, her strikes sharp and deliberate. Carter stayed close, his experience keeping them one step ahead of the rebels. The closer they got to the rebel headquarters, the fiercer the resistance became. At one point, they were pinned down by heavy fire, the rebels' superior numbers threatening to overwhelm them. "Keep moving," Carter shouted, returning fire. "They're trying to box us in." Lyra spotted a path through the rubble, a narrow alley that led directly to the headquarters entrance. "This way," she called, leading the team forward. The confrontation. The rebel headquarters was a towering structure, its dark exterior imposing against the fiery backdrop of the city. As Lyra and her team stormed inside, they were met with fierce resistance. The corridors became a battlefield, every step a fight for survival. At last, they'd reached the central chamber. The rebel commander stood waiting, his armor repaired from their last encounter. Behind him, a massive holographic map of the city displayed the ongoing battle. His cold eyes locked onto Lyra as she entered. "Back for more, princess," he sneered, drawing his weapon. "You should have stayed in hiding." Lyra raised her blade, her voice unwavering. "This ends now." The commander laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You think you've won? Look around you. Even if you kill me, the rebellion won't die. It's bigger than you, bigger than your father's rule." "Maybe," Lyra said, stepping forward. "But I'm not fighting alone." At her signal, Carter and the Loyalists opened fire, driving back the commander's guards. Lyra charged, her blade meeting the commander's in a clash of sparks. The duel was brutal, their movements fast and unrelenting. Every strike was a test of her strength, every block a battle against her fear. But Lyra had something the commander didn't: hope. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her people, for her father, and for the chance to rebuild what the rebellion had destroyed. The final blow. As the duel reached its peak, the commander made a critical mistake. Overconfident, he left an opening, and Lyra seized the moment. With a swift, calculated strike, she disarmed him, her blade pressing against his throat. "It's over," she said, her voice firm. The commander's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. But before Lyra could deliver the final blow, Carter spoke. "Killing him won't change the past," he said, "but it might change the future." Lyra hesitated, her blade trembling. She looked into the commander's eyes, seeing the hatred that had fueled the rebellion. Slowly, she lowered her weapon. "You'll face justice," she said, "not revenge. Victory and hope." With the commander captured and the Loyalists regaining control of the city, the tide of the battle shifted. The rebels, leaderless and scattered, began to surrender. The people of Avaris emerged from their hiding places, their cheers filling the air as the Loyalist flag was raised once more. In the aftermath, Lyra stood on the palace steps, looking out over her people. She was no longer the fragile princess who had fled in fear. She was a leader, a warrior, and a symbol of hope. Carter joined her, his usual smirk in place. "Not bad, princess," he said. "You might just survive this after all." Lyra smiled, the weight of her journey settling into a quiet resolve. "This is just the beginning," she said. "There's still so much to rebuild." "And you'll do it," Carter said. "Because now they know you're not someone to underestimate." As the twin suns rose over the city, Lyra knew her fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The warrior within her had awakened, and there was no turning back.